You know how the story goes. Pontius Pilate stands before the crowd. It's Passover. There's a custom. One prisoner released at the feast. A gesture of Roman clemency. A way to manage the city when it was packed with pilgrims who already had one eye on the horizon for signs of something, anything, that might mean the long occupation was finally coming to an end. Pilate gives the crowd a choice. On one side, Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher from Galilee accused of stirring up the people, of claiming to be the king of the Jews, of saying things in the temple that the high priest found intolerable. On the other side, a man named Barabbas, described in the Gospels as a criminal, a rebel, someone who had blood on his hands from a recent insurrection in the city. Luke calls him a man who had committed murder in the insurrection. Mark says the same. John uses the word robber, which in first-century Judean usage carried political overtones, the kind of man who operated on the margins of revolutionary activity, not merely a thief. The crowd shouts for Barabbas. Jesus is condemned. Barabbas walks free. That's the version I taught for 12 years. Standing in front of Catholic school juniors in a classroom on the second floor of a building that smelled like chalk dust and cafeteria bread, pointing at Matthew 27, walking them through the scene with whatever gravitas I could manage in the third period before lunch. One innocent man, rejected by his own people. One guilty man, released. The cruelty of the crowd. The tragedy of the moment. The weight of what was about to happen on Golgotha before the afternoon was over. Every year I taught it the same way, because that's how it had always been taught to me. The facts seemed clear. The meaning seemed obvious. You knew who Barabbas was. A criminal. You knew who Jesus was. Innocent. The crowd got it wrong. That's the story. Nobody in that classroom, including me, ever asked the obvious question. What was Barabbas's first name? That question sat dormant for 12 years. And when it finally surfaced, when I finally followed a footnote in a book that led to another book that led to a library archive in Indianapolis at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, what I found changed the shape of everything I thought I understood about that scene. Not the historical facts of what happened on that Friday in Jerusalem, but the meaning, the architecture of the confrontation. What Pilate was actually asking the crowd, what the crowd was actually choosing, and why someone, 17 centuries ago, with a pen and a stated reason and a theological argument he left in writing, made sure that you would never be able to read the scene the way it was originally written. Listen, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about how ancient names worked in first-century Judea. Because the word Bar-Abbas is hiding something in plain sight, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, the language his earliest followers used to transmit the first accounts of his life and teaching, before the Greek language Gospels were written, the vernacular of first-century Jewish Palestine, the word bar means son of. It's everywhere in the New Testament, completely unremarkable. A standard linguistic prefix that any reader of the period would have recognized immediately. Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah. That's Peter's full designation when Jesus first names him in Matthew 16, verse 17. Jesus says to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah." The son of Jonah, Joseph Bar-Abbas, son of Nabas, which is where the name Barnabas comes from, the traveling companion of Paul throughout the book of Acts, the man Luke describes as a good man full of the Holy Spirit. Nathanael Bar-Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy, which gives us Bartholomew. James and John are the sons of Zebedee, Bar-Zebedee in the Aramaic that would have been used by anyone at the time hearing their names. The prefix shows up constantly, woven into the fabric of how people identified themselves and each other. It's a patronymic particle, the way a surname in many cultures carries the lineage. So that's Bar, simple, son of. Now, Abba, If you've spent any time in a church, in any denomination that takes its liturgical language seriously, you know this word. It appears in Romans 8, verse 15, where Paul writes that Christians have not received a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but a spirit of adoption, by which they cry, Abba, Father. It appears in Galatians 4, verse 6, where Paul says God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. It appears in Mark 14, verse 36, the Gethsemane passage, the one where Jesus is alone in the garden after the supper, knowing what's coming, falling to the ground before His arrest, and He prays in a moment of raw human terror, Abba, Father, all things are possible to you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. 3 times the word is used in this specific intimate register, and in all 3 cases it's treated as a term that carries something beyond its translation. Paul doesn't just write Abba, he immediately glosses it, Abba, Father, as though the word itself communicates something the Greek word for father, pater, doesn't fully capture. Something warmer, something more immediate. Abba in Aramaic is the intimate address a child uses for a parent. Not the formal term, not the public title. The word you use at the breakfast table, in the private space of the family, in the moment when you need something and you reach for the person you trust most. Theologians and linguists have debated the exact register of the word for decades. Some have argued it's essentially equivalent to saying daddy, an argument that has been both embraced and contested. What's not contested is this. It's the familiar form, the relational form, the form that implies closeness, not distance. Not God, the cosmic sovereign, addressed from a posture of trembling submission. God as Father, addressed from a posture of belonging. Abba means Father, in the most personal, immediate, relational sense available in the language. Bar-Abbas, Bar, son of. Abbas, from Abba, Father. Son of the Father. That is not a name. That is a title. A designation of relationship, of identity, of claimed lineage going directly upward to the divine. It tells you not who his earthly father was, but what his claimed relationship to the highest authority was, the Son of the Father. And now think, very carefully, about what Jesus called himself, what his followers called him, what the theological claim at the center of his entire ministry was, the claim that horrified the Pharisees, that led the high priest at the trial before the Sanhedrin to tear his robes in a formal gesture of outrage and declare blasphemy. Jesus called God his Abba, not the theological abstraction, not the distant creator, not the God of formal temple liturgy addressed from behind layers of priestly mediation. His Father, personally, immediately, the relationship that made him, in the eyes of his accusers, someone who was making himself equal to God, the Son of the Father. So Pilate did not stand before that crowd with one man on one side and a random criminal on the other. He stood before that crowd with 2 men, both of whom, in their own way, through their own claims, through the very structure of their names and identities, and what those identities meant to the people listening, were sons of the Father. One whose title said, Son of the Father. One who said, God is my Abba, my Father. The Encyclopedia Britannica confirms it plainly. Bar-Abbas means Son of the Father. This is not disputed. This is not a fringe scholarly interpretation. This is what the name means in the language it comes from. Both men standing before that crowd, that Passover morning, carried the same designation of divine relationship. Now, the symmetry is either the most extraordinary coincidence in 2,000 years of religious narrative, or it was placed there deliberately, a confrontation structured around a single impossible question. Not, which man do you want? But, which version of divine sonship do you want? Which relationship with the Father do you choose when you have to choose? But here's the thing. That is only the first layer. because the symmetry goes deeper than a title. It goes into the manuscripts themselves, into what the texts originally said, before someone sat down with a pen and a stated theological argument and decided the symmetry was too dangerous to leave intact. There's a layer to this that sits below the standard telling of the story, below the version in the Pew Bible, below the version I taught 12 years of juniors on the second floor of a Catholic school. Most people never reach it. Not because it's hidden in some sealed archive, not because it requires access to classified documents, because nobody asks the question, because the question was removed before the text reached you. In some manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew, not obscure manuscripts, not fringe documents, not material discovered in a cave and disputed by two people in a basement seminar. In serious, catalogued, scholarly credentialed manuscripts that form part of the recognized textual tradition of the New Testament, the prisoner's name in the Bar-Abbas exchange is not just Barabbas, it is Jesus Barabbas. The prisoner's full name in these manuscripts was Jesus Bar-Abbas. Let me be precise, because precision matters here, and because this evidence is real, documented, and sits in the open literature of New Testament scholarship, where anyone with a library card and patience can read it. The manuscripts that preserve the reading Jesus Barabbas include the following: Codex Coridathi, identified in the manuscript tradition by the symbol theta, a 9th century Greek manuscript of the four Gospels held at the Institute of Manuscripts in Tbilisi, Georgia, considered an important witness to the Caesarean text tradition. Family 1, designated in scholarship as F1, a cluster of Greek manuscripts linked by a common ancestor and associated with the library at Caesarea Maritima, one of the recognized text families in the scholarly reconstruction of Matthew's textual history. Minuscule 700, an 11th century Greek manuscript held at the British Library in London. Lectionary 844, the Sinaitic Palimpsest, a Syriac translation of the New Testament discovered in 1892 at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Desert by Agnes Smith Lewis and her twin sister Margaret Dunlop Gibson, a manuscript written underneath a later text that had been scraped off and written over, which is what the word palimpsest means, and which was so old and so carefully concealed that Lewis initially didn't recognize what she had. The Palestinian Syriac lectionaries, preserving readings from early Christian communities in the geographic center of where the events being narrated actually took place. These manuscripts belong to what scholars call the Caesarean text tradition. This is not a minor strand of the New Testament manuscript tree. This is one of the recognized text families in the scholarly reconstruction of how the New Testament was transmitted in the ancient world, representing manuscripts copied and used by Christian communities in an unbroken geographical and historical line running through the early centuries of the Church. When Bruce Metzger examined this question, and if you have spent any time with the study of New Testament textual criticism, you know this name, because Metzger was one of the most careful, most conservative, most rigorous textual scholars of the 20th century, the man who edited the standard reference work that every biblical scholar keeps on their desk, a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, published by the United Bible Societies. When Metzger looked at the manuscript evidence for Jesus Barabbas in Matthew 27, he granted the reading what he called considerable weight. His stated conclusion: the name Jesus was probably deleted by copyists out of reverence. Not possibly. Probably. Cambridge University Press published a study in the journal New Testament Studies examining precisely this question under the title Jesus Barabbas, a Nominal Messiah. The scholars who worked through the manuscript evidence, among them Allen, Burkitt, Streeter, Gogwell, Lohmeyer, and Metzger himself, argued that the reading Jesus Barabbas stood in the original text of Matthew, not in a later edition, not in a scribal elaboration, in what Matthew first wrote, that it was removed sometime in the early transmission of the text by copyists who found it intolerable that the name Jesus could be attached to a criminal, a rebel, a man with blood on his hands. Tyndale House. one of the most respected centers of biblical scholarship in the world, housed at Cambridge, publishing work that is recognized across denominational and confessional lines, examined the same manuscript evidence in 2018 and reached consistent conclusions. The Caesarean manuscripts, the Sinaitic palimpsest, the Palestinian lectionaries preserve a reading that the later Alexandrian and Byzantine manuscript traditions quietly removed. So this is the picture. The original text of Matthew, the text that circulated in the earliest decades of Christianity, the text that was read in Christian communities across Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and beyond before the major manuscript families we rely on today took shape. May have said, Pilate asked the crowd which Jesus they wanted. Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus called the Messiah. Which Jesus do you want? But here's where this moves from uncomfortable to something that belongs in a different category. Because we don't have to speculate about who deleted the name. We don't have to look at patterns of textual transmission and infer intent from absence. We don't have to reconstruct the decision from circumstantial evidence. Someone left a record. Someone documented exactly what they found in the manuscripts, exactly what they decided to do with it, and exactly why. He told us himself. In writing, that still exists. His name was Origen. Origen of Alexandria. You need to understand who this man was because his fingerprints are on the text of the New Testament in ways that most Christians, most clergy, most seminary graduates, most people who have read the Bible their entire lives, never consider and are never told. Origen was born around 185 AD in Alexandria, Egypt. At that point in history, Alexandria was the most intellectually sophisticated city in the Roman world. It housed the Mausoleon, the institution we call the Library of Alexandria, which at its height held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, the largest collection of written knowledge in antiquity. It was a city where Greek philosophy, Jewish scholarship, Egyptian religious tradition, and the new and contested movement of Christianity collided and argued and transformed each other constantly. Origen grew up in that environment. His father, Leonidas, was executed during the persecution under Septimius Severus around 202 AD. The tradition says Origen wanted to turn himself in and die alongside him, and his mother prevented this by hiding his clothes. He died around 254 AD in Caesarea, possibly from injuries sustained during the Decian persecution under Emperor Decius, which swept through the Roman world beginning in 250 and targeted Christian leadership specifically. Origen was imprisoned and tortured. Whether the injuries killed him directly or broke his health irreparably is debated. Between birth and death, he produced a volume of work that staggered the ancient church. The historian Eusebius attempted to catalog it. Jerome, writing in the 4th century, estimated Origen had written 6,000 separate works. Even accounting for the inflation common in ancient encomia, the output was extraordinary. What did he write? Everything. Biblical commentaries covering nearly every book of both testaments. Apologetic works, most notably Contra Celsum, his detailed rebuttal of the pagan philosopher Celsus's attack on Christianity. Theological treatises on first principles, the first systematic theology in the history of the Church. Sermons, letters, scholia, brief notes on difficult passages, and the Hexapla, a 6-column comparison of the Old Testament in Hebrew and 5 different Greek translations, an act of textual scholarship so massive and so technically demanding that it had never been attempted before and has barely been replicated since. Origen was not a peripheral figure. He was not a minor commentator operating at the fringes. He was the person who built the intellectual architecture within which Christian biblical interpretation operated for centuries. His method, the allegorical approach, the layered reading that found literal, moral, and mystical meaning simultaneously in any given passage of Scripture, shaped how the Church read the Bible from the 3rd century through the medieval period and beyond. When you hear a sermon today that finds symbolic or spiritual meaning in a passage that was historically about something specific and concrete, you are, in some lineage, hearing Origen's method at work. His influence was so pervasive that later theologians, including Jerome and Ambrose and Gregory of Nyssa, were partly shaped by him even when they critiqued him. He was also, in his own commentary on Matthew, written around 246 AD, roughly 160 years after Matthew's Gospel was composed, the man who saw Jesus Barabbas in the manuscripts and told us what he did about it. He addresses the Bar-Abbas passage in Matthew 27 directly. He acknowledges that in some manuscripts, the prisoner is called Jesus Barabbas. He doesn't pretend the reading doesn't exist. He doesn't dismiss it as an obvious scribal error or a recent corruption. He sees it, he engages with it, and then he says, "And I need you to hear this carefully, because what follows is one of the most consequential editorial statements in the history of religious texts." He says that the name Jesus should not be applied to anyone who is impure, that it would be wrong, even in the historical record of a scripture, for that name to attach itself to someone sinful, criminal, violent, that the sacred name requires a kind of protection from contamination by proximity to evil, that it is an act of reverence, his word reverence, to remove the name from any context where it might appear to sanction or dignify the unworthy. Therefore, in manuscripts under Origen's influence, in the copies produced by scribes who were trained in his school and worked in the tradition he established at Caesarea in the last decades of his life, the name was removed. It became Barabbas. Just Barabbas. The title remained. The name was gone. This is not reconstructed. This is not inferred. This is documented in a text that survived, that scholars can read today, that is cited in the textual commentary literature. Origen wrote it down. We have what he found, and we have what he decided, and we have why. He found Jesus Barabbas in the manuscripts he was working with. He decided the symmetry was theologically dangerous. He deleted it, and he told us he did. Now sit with what that means. For approximately a century, from the composition of Matthew's Gospel somewhere around 80 to 90 AD, through the earliest transmission of that text across early Christian communities in Syria and Palestine and Egypt and the wider Roman world, the story read differently. Pilate's question, in the manuscripts that existed before Origen's editorial intervention became dominant in the tradition he controlled, was not merely, "Which of these two men shall I release?" It was, "Which Jesus do you want?" Pilate stood before that crowd with two men who shared the same name, both of them carrying in their own way the same identification. Son of the Father, one whose name was Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, Son of the Father, one who had spent his ministry saying that the Father was his Abba, that his sonship of the Father was the center of his identity and his authority. J.J. Benitez, working through the trial sequence in Caballo de Troya with his characteristic insistence on documentary reconstruction rather than devotional retelling, approaches the confrontation at the Praetorium not as a simple criminal proceeding between an innocent man and a guilty man, but as something that was structurally embedded in the political and theological crisis of first-century Jerusalem. The symmetry, in Benitez's analysis, was not an accident of nomenclature. Pilate, a Roman prefect who had governed Judea since 26 AD, who had been managing the combustible intersection of Roman authority and Jewish religious identity for years, who understood power and symbol and the management of occupied populations with considerably more sophistication than a provincial administrator is usually credited with, may have staged the confrontation deliberately, not because he was aware the manuscripts would one day be controversial, but because he understood, in the immediate political register of the moment, what the choice communicated. The crowd was not choosing between guilt and innocence. They were choosing between two messianic models, two visions of what it means to be the Son of the Father when your people are suffering. Two answers to the same question that was burning through first-century Jewish consciousness. What does God want from his Son when Rome is in charge of Jerusalem? The one who fights, the one who disrupts, the one who channels the tradition of Maccabean resistance, who picks up the sword, who offers his followers the dignity of armed defiance against an occupying empire. Jesus Barabbas, the revolutionary, the man whose hands were already stained with the violence of the insurrection, or the one who forgives, the one who says to love your enemies, to turn the other cheek, to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, the one who, when Peter draws a sword in the garden, tells him to put it away, the one whose kingdom, as he says to Pilate himself at the trial, is not of this world. Which son of the Father do you want? And go all the way back to where we started. You know how the story goes. Pontius Pilate stands before the crowd. He gives them a choice between Jesus and a criminal named Barabbas. The crowd chooses Barabbas. Jesus is condemned. But what the story originally said, before Origen sat down with a pen and a theological argument, and the manuscripts spread across his desk in Caesarea, was this: Pilate stands before the crowd and gives them a choice between two men named Jesus. He asks, "Which Jesus do you want?" And the crowd chooses. They choose Jesus Barabbas. They choose the Son of the Father who will fight. They send the Son of the Father who will not fight to the cross. The crucifixion narrative, as it has been read for 17 centuries, is a story about two men. One named Jesus. But the manuscripts Origen worked from preserved something he found too dangerous to leave intact. A story about two men with the same name, the same title, and two completely different answers to what God requires of his sons. What it looks like to be the Son of the Father in a world that is broken. Whether that sonship means power or sacrifice, whether the Father wants you to take or to give everything away. I'm still not sure about this part. Not because the evidence isn't there, because it is. Because it has been sitting in the open scholarly literature for over a century, cited by some of the most careful textual minds of the modern era. But because of what it asks of you once you have actually heard it. This doesn't stay in the library in Indianapolis. It doesn't stay in a footnote in Metzger or a paper in Cambridge University Press. It follows you home. It sits at the kitchen table. It comes into the classroom with you if you've ever stood at a chalkboard trying to explain why things go wrong. When you understand what Pilate's question may originally have been, which Jesus do you want? The entire moral register of the Good Friday scene changes, not the facts of what happened, but what the scene is about. What it asks of the person reading it. The version that has existed since Origen's editorial decision is a story with a clear moral structure. Two men, one innocent, one guilty. A crowd, irrational, manipulated, morally blind. A choice, obvious in retrospect, catastrophic in execution. And you, the reader, standing safely outside the scene, knowing which man you would have chosen. You would have chosen Jesus. You can see clearly what the crowd could not. But here's the thing. That distance is exactly what Origen manufactured. He didn't just delete a name. He deleted the precision of the choice. He transformed which version of divine sonship do you want into do you want the innocent man or the guilty man? He turned a question about theology and identity and what salvation means. A question that has no clean answer. A question that communities and movements and individuals have been wrestling with in every generation since. Into a question with an obvious answer that makes you feel smart for getting it right. He gave you the comfortable version. The original version puts you in the crowd. Think about what 12 years of teaching felt like. Standing at that chalkboard in third period, explaining the tragedy of the Passion scene to 17-year-olds who were already thinking about lunch. The version I taught them was legible and clear. The crowd chose wrong. The crowd let fear and mob psychology and political pressure override their moral judgment. This is what crowds do. This is what people do. Don't be like the crowd. That lesson works fine as long as you're standing outside the scene. As long as you're looking at it from 2,000 years of distance, with the outcome already known, with the theological consequences already settled, with the knowledge of what was at stake that none of the people in that crowd possessed. But what if the original text doesn't give you that distance? What if the original text says, "The crowd stood before two men named Jesus, two sons of the Father, one who fought back and one who didn't, one who offered resistance and one who offered surrender, one who said, 'The kingdom of God is coming now with force in this lifetime, in this body,' and one who said, 'The kingdom is not of this world.' And you have to choose, not the crowd, you, the person reading the text, the person sitting in the church on Good Friday, the person who has been occupied, suffering, waiting for something to change for longer than they can remember. Which son of the Father do you reach for? The choice the crowd made in Jerusalem is not a one-time moral catastrophe that belongs to first-century history. It is a recurring human question. Every generation of people living under conditions of suffering and powerlessness faces some version of it. What do you do with your pain? Do you channel it into resistance? Physical, forceful, immediately satisfying? Or do you channel it into something slower, harder, less visible, that does not promise results in your lifetime? Which Jesus do you want? Origen understood that if his congregations read the original text of Matthew 27, they would feel that question land on them. They would not be able to maintain the safe distance of, "The crowd chose wrong." They would recognize themselves in the crowd's predicament. They would have to sit with it. They would have to ask, in the privacy of their own grief and exhaustion and political desperation under whatever form of Roman or post-Roman power was pressing on them, which son of the Father do I actually want? Which answer to suffering do I actually believe in? Which version of divine sonship am I actually choosing with my life, with what I resist and what I surrender to? He deleted the name to protect the clarity of the story, to keep the crowd's choice legible as obvious error, to preserve the distance between you, the reader, and the people who shouted for Barabbas. He did not want you seeing yourself in the crowd. For 17 centuries, most people haven't. When I first read this, sitting in a library in Indianapolis, following a footnote in a book by Bar-Abbas that led me to Metzger's textual commentary, that led me to the Cambridge study, that led me finally to Origen's commentary on Matthew, in a database at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I sat with it for a long time. I didn't call anyone. I didn't rush to put it in a lesson plan. I went home and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about 12 years. I had taught those students that the crowd chose wrong, and they had nodded because the answer was obvious, because the version of the story I had been given made the answer obvious. The innocent man was on one side. The guilty man was on the other. The crowd, pressured by the chief priests, shouted for the wrong one. But in the original text, in what Matthew may actually have written, in what Origen read and then removed, the two men on either side of Pilate were both named Jesus, both sons of the Father, and Pilate asked the crowd to choose between them. In that version, the crowd's answer is not obvious moral failure. It's a choice that makes terrible, human, comprehensible sense. They chose the Son of the Father who looked like action, who looked like something that might actually work, who looked like the Father's power made visible and immediate and applicable to the situation at hand. And in that version, you don't get to stand outside the scene and feel superior. You have to ask yourself the question, which Jesus do you want? That question was in the original text. Someone made sure you would never have to answer it. You decide what to do with this. If this research reaches you, if something in what we've worked through tonight opened a door you didn't know was closed, and you want to support what we're doing here, Super Thanks is right there below the video. It goes directly into keeping this work going. The hours in library archives, the manuscript trail, the sources that don't make it into Sunday school curricula. Every contribution helps more than you know. And here's what I genuinely want to know from you. In the comments below, which layer hit hardest? Was it the title itself, Bar-Abbas, Son of the Father, A designation of identity and relationship rather than a personal name? Was it the manuscripts, the specific codices and papyri that preserved the name Jesus Barabbas before Origen's intervention reshaped the tradition? Was it Origen himself? The fact that the deletion is documented, stated plainly in his own writing, confessed with a reason given? Or was it the question he removed? Which Jesus do you want? And what that question means when you stop thinking about first-century Jerusalem and start thinking about your own choices, your own life, what you reach for when things are broken. Leave it below. I read every comment. This conversation is the reason we're here.